Hi, Fiber Arts class. Today we're going to talk about your final culminating project of the semester, which is your art quilt with the theme of identity. Today's goal is really just to give you some ideas to get you started sketching and envisioning what your design will look like. So let's hop over to some visuals. The art quilt. So what is an art quilt? Essentially, we're going to think of it like a fabric collage constructed in a pictorial or abstract way, such as these three examples, which is different than a more traditional block quilt. Well, traditional or even modern design block quilt. And there's probably people that will dispute this distinction. I'm simplifying quite a bit. But our quilt is intended for personal expression and to be hung on a wall as a piece of art to enjoy visually versus a piece that is functional for a bedspread, for example, and is different in the way that it's going to be constructed, in that it's more of a collage where you're layering pieces and sewing in free motion style on top, versus the more traditional way of making quilts in which you're taking pieces, creating seams, unfolding them, creating more seams, and constructing them in a piece-by-piece way, which is also has an incredible history and tradition to go along with it too. The theme I want you to play with is identity, and in essence that means it's an image that is reflective of you and who you are. You don't have to think too complex or get existential about it, though you know the avenue for that is always there. To start, let's simplify it and bring to mind moments, places, things, and or people that are connected to a sense of who you are. So here's some student examples from the past several years of doing this project at Nerinx. This first quilt is by a student who is focusing on her identity through a sense of place where she grew up, South City, and is using some stylistic choices to sort of illustrate an aesthetic feeling that she relates to South City. This sort of like grime and grunge that makes her feel like who she is. So her upbringing in this place, as she interprets it, is a big part of who she is. This middle image is the student worked from a photo reference of a person who she interacted with that made a big impression on her life. And then this last one over here is also, the student also worked with a photo reference initially, and she chose to represent a Raggedy Ann doll that was important to her in her childhood, and she connects to her sense of self in that I believe her nickname was Raggedy Ann when she was growing up, and so her family sort of connected the story of Raggedy Ann to her personality, and I suppose it stuck a little bit. So I did mention that these two used photo references as a starting point, and the first one was an original drawing from the student. These two I also love. This first one was a drawing made by the student as she's celebrating an idea of community and service and helping one another. And so she has this image of a tree with members of a community lifting each other up and climbing this tree together in a playful and supportive way. And she also chose to embroider various words that are important to her in terms of the story that she's telling about herself. And you can see those there too. And And actually, as I'm looking closer, I'm remembering that what's going on is that she's letting go of these negative words as represented by leaves that are falling in autumn. This student on the right wanted to focus on her sense of family. She's got a big family, lots of brothers and sisters, and brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law. And so what she did was really neat. She reached out to her family. All of family members kind of live sort of all across the country. And she asked them to send her a tracing of their hands. And so either she did that physically in the mail, or she got an image. Either way, she recreated those tracings of the actual outline of her family member's hand, and cut them out of fabric and arranged them in this way, and also used skin tone as a storytelling element here in talking about her identity too. So memories might be a great place for you to draw some inspiration. This student was thinking about a wonderful summer that she had with her family, going cross country to all 50 states, I believe was the story, in her family's station wagon. Really pretty incredible work here. So she started with a map of the US, of course, that I think she printed it out, or she had a physical paper one that helped her figure out what all these shapes ought to look like. And then she worked with a sketch of her family car. I want you also to consider the meaning of materials that you might end up using. So in these two examples, let's see, trying to get my face out of the way, is what it is. In these two examples, over here, this student was sort of exploring her relationship with her grandmother. Her grandmother had passed away and her family was living in her grandmother's home, and there was still so many belongings of her grandmother that surrounded her and reminded her all the time, even though she didn't know her grandmother very well in life. And so she's learning about who she is through her items that have been left behind. And so each of these materials are actually scraps of actual things that at one time belonged to her grandmother, or they're yeah, it's a combination of things, or they're colored fabric that she's using to construct an image of an object that reminds her of her grandmother. So she's even incorporated a stuffed animal and a patch in here. And this is from a quilt that her grandmother maybe had made from her, and her grandmother's handkerchief, and all sorts of other highly symbolic materials here. This one over here is equally as wonderfully interesting in terms of material. So this image, the student was talking, kind of reflecting upon her identity and her family heritage. And so what she's done, if you look really closely, is that she has played, first of all, sort of with contrasting color to talk about homogeny versus a more diverse sort of community over here. And then she's used an image of her own face to create a self-portrait, but the self-portrait, the values are created with pieces of her mother's kimono. So really highly interesting and meaningful. Also consider the meaning of process here. The student chose to do something totally different from the initial prompt, which in the end I thought was really incredible. So she was very interested in the meditative quality of slow hand stitching, instead of the more, I guess, efficient work of using a sewing machine. She really wanted to take the time to hand stitch everything and to have pieces more like a traditional patchwork quilt, but in an improvised way of piecing them together. And each piece to her was meaningful. So she has symbols related to various memories, related to various things that she relates to herself, as well as pieces of fabric that are taken from things like her clothing or domestic like blankets that she had around her house. So here she's thinking about the meaning of materials and process together, and chose to do it in a very unique way. So I want to also be sure that we're recognizing the great Faith Ringgold, who is known for the story quilt. This is one of her pieces, Double Dutch on the Golden Gate Bridge, 1988. Faith is a painter, and she often, not always, but will often paint upon fabric and then create a hanging fabric wall piece with patchwork involved. And there's a lot of meaning seeped into that that's related to her identity as well. Sorry, going back. Sunflower Quilting Bee at Arles, 1991. You can see that there's great consideration of story and heritage and identity and culture in the themes that she is working with. For more on Faith, I really encourage you to visit her website, faithringgold.com, and there's also many books that discuss her work within art history, and her work is represented at museums internationally. And I'd like to share with you a video that I think will help you understand why she's so fabulous.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct, but it's wordy and hard to read. It underlines the writer's message, and the word choice is blurred.
This isn't working.
Grammarly's cutting-edge technology helps you craft compelling, understandable writing that makes an impact on your reader. Much better.
I remember when I was young and I would go into a gallery to show my work. The gal would look at my legs, but not my arm.
Sorry, my face is going to be here.
I was born during the Great Depression, and I lived in Harlem from the time I was a little kid. I always had my crayons and my father brought me my first easel. I had my paint. Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima was my first story quilt. We know Aunt Jemima as this person on a pancake box. I rewrote Aunt Jemima's whole story. She becomes an entrepreneur and she's just fabulous in my story. They would call the guys inside to sit around the table to talk to the curators and to the directors. You understand? But not me. The museum will open up to African American artists, but you won't be one of them because you're a woman. Okay, I got it. Well, I decided that I needed to get involved with women's issues. At the Whitney Museum in 1970, they had biennials. They had very few women leaders. The last one that they had, I believe, was like 2%, 2 women. I said, what percentage of women do we demand? So my daughter, she said, 50% women. You want 50% of the people in the finale to be women. You know, we blow our whistles. We had police whistles that we blew. We had eggs. I boiled mine and painted them black and put 50% on mine. It felt like we were doing something. And we were a part of the movement in America to equalize it. You can't sit around waiting for somebody else to say who you are. You need to write it and paint it and do it. That's where the art comes from. It's a visual image of who you are. That's the power of being an artist.
I think you can see why she's fabulous. First of all, as a person, and why her art matters so much within art history. So what I want you to take away from her is what she said right there at the end, that the power of being an artist is that you get to share who you are through your artwork. And that's important, especially as women artists. So what I want you to do right now is to start brainstorming and sketching. When you sketch, focus first on content and then focus on composition. Consider your dimensions, whether you want your piece to be square or rectangular. A 4 by 5 inch sketch is a good place to maybe start if you're thinking rectangle, because that can translate to a 16 by 20. You can start to consider your color palette, kind of how complex versus how simple. In other words, like how much negative space and texture, as well as how you'll create depth with your foreground and your background. But also remember that you're never married to your sketch. It's just a step. It's step one in the concept. You can make changes as you go, and that's great. All right. Enjoy the process.